Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Murray, instructor for EU and US climate change mitigation with 20 participants from the EU, the United States, and other Paris Agreement countries. This morning, Dr. Christina Voigt has agreed to join us. She is professor of law at the University of Oslo, Norway, and a renowned expert in international environmental law. She is passionate about legal issues of climate change, environmental multilateralism, and sustainability. Professor Voigt has published widely on these topics and is a frequent speaker at international and national events. She is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. For more than 10 years, she also worked as legal advisor and negotiator for the government of Norway in UN climate negotiations. She is currently first co-chair of the Paris Agreement's Implementation and Compliance Committee, also known as the PAICC. Dr. Voigt, thank you for agreeing to consider our questions this morning.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
All right. I would like to begin with COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Many of us had high expectations for it to achieve significant progress with measures to reduce carbon emissions in line with our goals for 2030. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asserted that it concluded with much homework and little time. From your perspective, what were its most significant achievements, and what homework did it give to the world community on the road to COP28?
Well, from the outset, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt wasn't meant to be a mega COP. There wasn't any particular negotiation mandate that would have suggested a significant outcome on mitigation or really anything else. So it was actually a very big surprise that it did deliver what it delivered. One particular outcome that everybody, I think, has heard about is the establishment of financial arrangements to cover loss and damage, but also the mitigation work program, which got more detail in Sharm el-Sheikh, are important outcomes. When it comes to increasing parties' ambition in their NDCs, I think we have to be a little maybe careful or realistic. We have the processes that are set in motion under the Paris Agreement, which foresee a 5-year timeline for submission of new NDCs with progression and higher ambition. But currently there is this annual expectation that parties every year increase their ambition. And I think that is perhaps not really realistic, because every NDC requires significant domestic processes to go through, hearings and involvement of stakeholders. And to expect that parties do this every single year is perhaps not exactly what we can realistically expect. But sticking to the 5-year processes that the Paris Agreement set up, in my view, is maybe a more helpful and optimistic process to follow through. But we did see a couple of parties increasing their ambition, and we will so every year. But the real important point in time that we need to look forward to is 2025, when every single party has to submit a successive NDC. And that is a legal obligation, not just an invitation or expectation, but it's something that parties have to do.
Well, thank you very much for that response. You mentioned the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And as I understand it, we are in a 5-year phase from 2020 to 2025 that was made a little more challenging by COVID at the beginning of that period. And it seems to me that at COP27, one of the achievements that you might consider most significant was the adoption of the PAICC rules of procedure. And it seems to me that they are focused quite a bit on implementation and compliance in the context of those nationally determined contributions. Could you talk a little bit more about PAICC and its work and how those rules of procedure passing help it to work more effectively?
Absolutely. If there's one topic I'm happy to talk about, then it is the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, which was already established in the Paris Agreement itself in Article 15, but it took a while until it became operational. And one reason was that it first needed its rules of procedure, because it didn't really have much procedural rules to follow. So for the first 3 years, the members of the committee elaborated these rules, those draft rules, and they were put forward to already actually to COP26 in Glasgow, but now finally to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh for adoption. And that happened. It didn't capture a lot of media attention, but the COP, actually the CMA, that's the governing body for the Paris Agreement, adopted a full set of procedural rules for the compliance committee. And that's a very important step forward because, as I said initially, the committee needed those rules in order to become operational, which means that now that those rules are in place, the committee can finally start its operation, its function. And that is to facilitate implementation, meaning it can help support individual parties if they have any challenge with implementing any provision under the Paris Agreement, and promote compliance. Compliance, in the view of the committee, only refers to the legally binding elements of the Paris Agreement. They're not that very many, but there are some. But finally, the committee can work and can function, and that is a sea change in a way for the committee itself.
I have a question about that. Sometimes people ask, what does your workday look like? And in this case, it's not the case that you're implementing and complying, facilitating that every day. But what is the committee's work operation? Does it meet weekly or monthly? And in this process that has begun now, is it also the case that it looks at the nationally determined contributions and other reports that the signatories provide? Yeah,
well, let me take the first the first part is how does the committee work? How often does it meet? It is supposed to meet at least twice a year, so not weekly, at least twice a year. But for the last 3 years, we have met much more often than that, and that's because the committee had a really concrete mandate to work on, and that was its rules of procedure that took a long time for the committee to elaborate. But we meet formally twice a year in person in Bonn at the seat of the Secretariat to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but we also meet informally online. So in effect, we have about 4 to 5 meetings per year. So maybe every other month, plus or minus, the committee would meet either in person or online. But the second part, would the committee look into the nationally determined contributions by parties? Well, it does, but only whether a party has an NDC or not. So the question is, does a party have an NDC in the registry, the formal registry for NDCs that everybody can look into? It's at the United Nations Framework Convention's website. And the question is, does a party have an NDC or not? Has it submitted an NDC? Has it maintained an NDC or not? That is something that the committee constantly keeps an eye on. But the committee does not look whether the NDC is ambitious enough or progressed compared to the previous one or reflect a party's highest possible ambition, because these are not legally binding elements of the Paris Agreement. These are recommendations, expectations, and it was not the will of the parties that the committee should, in a way, open the NDC and look into it and say whether party X has an NDC that is ambitious enough. That's not part of what the committee can do. However, a party can always come to the committee. Any party at any time can come to the committee with any challenge that it faces. And it is not unthinkable, although it may be unlikely, but it's not unthinkable that a party could come to the committee and say, this is our NDC, but we face challenges in meeting it and meeting our goals and achieving our NDC. Can you help us? Can you support us in our capacity, for example, to achieve our NDC? But that would have to come from a party itself. The committee from its own cannot do that. But that's a possibility. It hasn't happened yet. But then again, the committee isn't yet so well known. We do a lot of outreach and capacity building about what the committee is and what it can do. But that could be one possibility of how an NDC could come to the committee's work.
Before I go on to my next question, I just want to ask one more about facilitating. And using this example, let's say that a country does come to the committee and asks for help, helping it with its facilitating powers. What might that look like?
That's a very good question. The committee has part of the Paris Agreement Rulebook contains the modalities and procedures for the committee. It's different from the rules of procedure, but that would take us too deep into the regulatory framework. But in those modalities and procedures, we have a whole kind of toolbox of what the committee can do once it actually has a case. And this toolbox is not exhaustive. There are other things that the committee in the course of its work can adopt, but it foresees first, of course, a dialogue with the party concerned, that's a given, but the committee can also help and support a party in its outreach to the support mechanisms that exist under the Paris Agreement and under the Framework Convention. There are many on capacity building, on adaptation, on finance. So if a party experiences challenges in getting into contact with these capacity building or with these support mechanism, the committee can come in and help in that context. It can also give recommendations to the party concerned, and it can communicate those recommendations to those support mechanisms. As I said, this is all in the procedural modalities and procedures. We haven't done that yet, so it would have been interesting to see, how this pans out in practice, but this is what the committee can do. But as I said, it's not exhaustive. There could be other things that the committee could adopt, and we will probably have to see once it starts its operative work, what else there might be.
Thank you very much. This next question will demonstrate the extent to which I'm continuing on my own learning curve with the Paris Agreement, and it has to do with the Paris Rulebook. One of the achievements of COP26 in Glasgow was adopting that, and I find it one of the more challenging things to understand. Last year when we spoke, you mentioned that the Paris Rulebook is actually a number of decisions that have been made during the past several years. And what I would like to ask, if you would be willing to describe just a little bit how those rules combine, or those decisions, to constitute the Paris Rulebook, and if the PAICC is able, I think you've already answered that to some extent, to use them in its work, and also what other Paris Agreement bodies use the Paris Rulebook in their work.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, because I think many, there's a lot of confusion out there what the rule book is, because it's not one single book. But as you rightly said, it's a collection of decisions of the governing body for the Paris Agreement, which I mentioned previously. It's called the CMA. It's not the COP, is the governing body for the convention, for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the CMA, which stands for the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, adopts decisions for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Now, the rule book, which is a set of decisions by that CMA, was already established or adopted to a large extent in Katowice in 2018, with a large number of decisions, minus the decisions on cooperative approaches or carbon markets. That was the last bit that was missing, and that was added in Glasgow. And with those decisions on carbon trading, on emissions trading, the possibility for market-based approaches, now the rulebook is complete. But what is it and where does it come from? And I think to understand it, you have to go back to the Paris Agreement and the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement in 2015 itself. Because if you have a look at the Paris Agreement, it's not a very long agreement. It's just like 10 pages or so. It was very difficult to negotiate, and was also very clear that we would not be able to include all the details of how the Paris Agreement should affect or function and be effective could be included in that decision or in the agreement itself from Paris. So we see a lot of mandates to that CMA at its first meeting to adopt more precise rules, more detailed rules, for example, for the global stocktake or for reporting, for the enhanced transparency framework, or for how parties have to communicate their NDCs, what kind of information they have to provide when they communicate their NDCs, or for the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee. So for all these elements, for 3 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, parties negotiated those detailed rules, and in 2018, in Katowice, adopted that rulebook. And then plus the additional decisions on Article 6 that were added in 2020. In COP26 in 2020 in Glasgow. So if you want to look for the Paris Agreement rulebooks, you have to look at all these decisions throughout those years and kind of compile them. There is no particular compilation that you can find anywhere, but you have to go into the subject matter and then see what the CMA adopted in 2018.
In addition to PAICC, then, who is it who goes and looks at those decisions to make sure that the members, the parties, are following the rules?
Well, first of all, I hope it's the parties themselves that know the rules quite well, because they are done by the parties, for the implementation, the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. So they have to know them, especially when it comes to reporting, when it comes to NDC submission, as I already said. However, when it comes to reporting, for example, we know that the first time that the biennial transparency reports are due is in 2024. So this is still in the future. Parties still have time to study those rules. The same applies in a way to the NDC, the submission of a successive NDC, which for the first time is due in 2025. So parties can still get, used to what they have to do. But which other bodies under the Paris Agreement look into these rules? So in particular, when it comes to the reporting, I mean, let me just take one step back. We know that parties have to communicate an NDC, National Determined Contribution, every 5 years. We know that what is in their NDC, their targets and measures, is not legally binding. And for that reason, it is very important that they are open and transparent about what they're doing domestically. And that's why the transparency framework is such a crucial building block of the Paris Agreement. But in order to report properly, we have this whole set of rules. And every party will have to report every other year, starting in 2024, on how it implements and achieves its NDC. Even though it is not legally binding what they're doing, it is legally binding that they're reporting on what they're doing. So that has to happen every other year, 2024, 2026, 2028, and so forth. And every party's report will have to be reviewed by a technical expert review team. It's a team of independent experts who look at every party's report every other year. And those experts will also have to know those rules very well in order to, of course, check whether parties reported in accordance with the rules that they have to follow when reporting. So that's one example of where those rules come in. We also have detailed rules for the global stocktake. This year is an important year. I know there's a question on COP28 this year in the United Arab Emirates. This year is for the first time that we will have a global stocktake, which will also take place every 5 years on 2023, 2028, and so forth. And the Paris Agreement rulebooks also contains very detailed rules for how the global stocktake is supposed to be conducted. And that's important for parties. It's important for the presidency of the COP, where a global stocktake takes place. It's important for the secretariat, who supports the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So these rules are important for parties, for constituted bodies, for the secretariat, for stakeholders, for everyone who is interested in an effective operation of the Paris Agreement.
I listened carefully, and I think I learned something for the work in our course, and that has to do also with being open and transparent and permitting independent bodies also to look and see what is happening. I know that in our course, one of the tools we use is the Climate Action Tracker, which looks at each nation and also offers a global view and, in a sense, grades from, like you would be graded for a course. And the Paris Agreement and the Paris Rulebook allows for a tool to measure what has happened and what is happening. Also, I think very good based on what countries have committed to do on their own. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring in the Climate Action Tracker, which is a very important tool. It operates outside the Paris Agreement, but it's something that very many follow very closely because it assesses the ambition of parties in their NDC. And I think for the Climate Action Tracker, it will be very important to see then the first biannual transparency reports coming out, where parties actually have to tell what kind of measures they're adopting in order to implement the NDC. One thing is to just have the numbers. That's pretty much what the Climate Action Tracker looks at. But another thing is, are the measures in place to put effective actions behind those numbers on the domestic level? And that is what parties need to tell us every other year starting from next year. And I think this is going to be a very important source of information for anyone interested in climate action, because it can be used, for being critical, for praising, for peer review, for peer pressure. That is the whole idea of being transparent, in order to allow those ambition mechanisms, which are based on pressure and criticism, to kick in motion.
Thank you very much. I feel like I've taken a step forward in my understanding. That leads me to my fourth question, which is perhaps a challenging one. At the COP27, former Vice President Al Gore called for changing the business models of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. His claim was that there's policy and then there's the market, and both are very, very important. According to him, they must accept more risk and systematically leverage private finance for developing countries at reasonable costs. The Secretary General amplified that message in his closing remarks. In its role as Paris Agreement facilitator, does the PAICC have any role in completing this homework assignment?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. Again, not directly. The PAICC looks, for example, it looks at finance issues in terms of whether developed country parties are reporting on their financial plans, their ex-ante finance, what they are intending to provide in terms of finance, and also their ex-post reports. So there's a financial element there. But an interesting aspect that might be explored in more detail is that the compliance committee also has a systemic function, and that systemic function is understood to address issues where there is a systemic problem, not with regard to individual parties' performance, but something that systemically isn't quite working right under the Paris Agreement. It's a very open definition. It could be a lot of different things, but it could also be the fact that the finance elements don't work properly, or there are some challenges with regard to the rules of how finance is being governed. This is food for future. It is nothing that the committee has been dealt with so far, but there is a very broad function which could be explored in more detail over time. But that's probably for another set of co-chairs to come in the future. But one aspect on finance, because you mentioned multilateral development banks, one very interesting outcome from Sharm el-Sheikh is the Sharm el-Sheikh plan of implementation, the first decision that is being taken. It's usually referred to as the cover decision because it's the first decision. And if you look into that, for the first time ever, at least as far as I know, there is an expectation or invitation to multilateral development banks and other financial actors to come on board and to support a global pathway towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions, towards finance flows that are consistent with low emission development. And that has never happened before. That is new from Sharm el-Sheikh. It didn't seem to have attracted that much attention so far. But in my view, it's a very important development that the parties reach out to non-party stakeholder, to a wider set of actors in that important field of finance, and try to bring them on board, because that's the only way we can hope that the transition that needs to happen very fast and very profoundly is happening. And that is where, of course, economic players, finance players need to be on board.
Well, thank you for drawing our attention to that cover decision. And I'm also thinking about what you've said so far and how it might be possible that a member with a nationally determined contribution would reach out to PAICC and say, we have a challenge in reaching our goals, and we would like to know what you would advise with financial challenges we have. And in that case, you might then, I suppose, refer to what happened at Sharm el-Sheikh and encourage that kind of interaction with multilateral investment banks.
That could be. I cannot anticipate an hypothetical case of what the committee would do in that particular situation, but I'm sorry. But the interesting element of PAICC is that it's supposed to facilitate the implementation of all provisions of the Paris Agreement. And when it comes to the overall goals of the Paris Agreement, we know a lot about the temperature goal, and everybody knows about the temperature goal. But in that very same article, Article 2, there's also two more goals. One is on adaptation, but there's also a finance goal, which talks about making finance flows consistent with low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development, which is on the exact same level as that global temperature goal, which everybody talks about, and not very many talk about that finance goal. So I think it's a very important discourse that has to happen, within but outside the Paris Agreement as well, about what that global finance goal contains, who does it talk to, which actors should, align their action with that goal. And you would very fast see that it's about investment decisions, it's about subsidies, it's about multilateral banks, profiles, and there are many other players which should and could, be implementing that goal much better than what's happening so far.
We in March also are going to have a briefing with someone from the World Bank office in Washington, D.C., as well as from the World Bank group in Vienna. And it provides us now a better informed platform for asking questions about what we are discussing from their perspective. Thank you very much for that too. And I'll move on to my last question, which you know is about the next COP in Dubai in November, December of this year. And I would like to ask if you'd be willing to describe any visions of what you think might be on the agenda for that meeting and what it might accomplish.
Yeah, so COP28 and CMA5 in Dubai this year is important. And you don't have to be a visionary to know that the first global stock take is going to take place, because that was decided a long time ago. And the stock take, in my view, is a very important element of the whole Paris universe, because the global stock take is supposed to take stock of parties' collective progress towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is the temperature goal, but also the adaptation goal and also the finance goal, which are all mentioned in Article 2. So it is a global exercise of where are we collectively in meeting these goals and what is missing still. And it's going to be a lot that's missing, but that missing part is supposed to inform the next round of NDCs. So that important element of being aware of where we are and where we need to be, and aligning our next round of NDCs with, what needs to be done, is a very important element of that ratcheting up idea that is ingrained into the Paris Agreement itself. So that's going to take place for the first time ever this year in Dubai. What also is important to keep an eye on is, of course, the mitigation work program, which was established already in Glasgow, but got more detailed rules last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's supposed to organize 2 global dialogues every year on mitigation focused topics. It will be something where probably parties meet in in Dubai as well, in order to discuss a topic of global interest with regard to mitigation. And the third element, which will, I'm sure, be absolutely important and in the core of the media eye, will be the details for the financial arrangements for loss and damage. We know that there was a fund, loss and damage response fund, established last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, but that's also where the decision ends, basically, because we don't know exactly who is going to pay in this fund. What is the money going to? Who will be receiving the financial means? All that is being put into a transitional committee, which has the mandate to work out all the details throughout this year for adoption in Dubai. And that is going to be, I guess, very difficult work for that transitional committee, and probably also very difficult negotiations in Dubai when that time comes, because they're intricate questions that were not able to be resolved in Dubai, in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that still remain on the table. But these questions have to be resolved in order to make that fund operational. And I guess there will be a lot of focus on that as well at the end of this year.
Dr. Voigt, during the talk this morning, you mentioned at one point food for thought, and you have provided us a great deal of food for thought. I want to thank you very much for offering us that. I know that breakfast, I think, is waiting for you right now, so this might be a good time to stop. Just once again, I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your very interesting and challenging questions. Questions have to be challenging. They have to, make you think, and thank you so much for that. And I hope that the students enjoy both your questions and the answer, and, make them think more about these topics. That's not the last word to be said about it. There is so much more, and it's in constant flux, which of course makes it so fascinating, but it's also something that has to happen quickly and urgently, as we all know. Thank you so much, and back to you to Vienna.
All right. And as we say here in Vienna, for your breakfast, guten Appetit.
Dankeschön.